William James asked a question that seems obvious until you really think about it. When you see a bear and run, are you afraid and therefore running, or are you running and therefore afraid? His answer was radical. You are afraid because you are running. The physiological response comes first, and the emotional label follows. Every major theory of emotion since James has been either building on or arguing against this simple but profound reversal. William James and Carl Lange independently proposed in the 1880s that emotions are not causes of physiological arousal, but rather are the perceptual experience of physiological responses. You do not see a bear, feel afraid, and run. You see a bear, your body responds, heart pounding, muscles tensing, flight beginning, and your brain interprets these physiological changes as fear. The emotion is the awareness of the body's state. The James-Lange theory implies that different emotions correspond to different physiological patterns, and that artificially inducing the physiological pattern should produce the corresponding emotion. Walter Cannon challenged the James-Lange theory by pointing out that visceral physiological responses are too slow, too similar across emotions, and too undifferentiated to be the source of the rapid, richly differentiated emotional experiences we have. Philip Bard added that severing the cortex from subcortical structures in animals did not eliminate emotional behavior. The Cannon-Bard theory proposes that the thalamus simultaneously sends signals to both the cortex, producing the subjective experience, and the body, producing the physiological arousal when a stimulus is encountered. Experience and arousal occur together but are generated independently. Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer's two-factor theory proposes that emotion is a product of two factors, undifferentiated physiological arousal and a cognitive label that the person applies to explain the arousal. If you are physiologically aroused and attribute it to something frightening, you experience fear. If you attribute the same arousal to something exciting, you experience excitement. Their 1962 experiment injected participants with adrenaline and exposed them to a Confederate acting either euphoric or angry. The physiologically aroused participants who lacked a clear explanation for their arousal adopted the Confederates' emotional state, suggesting emotion is partly a social construction. Richard Lazarus's appraisal theory proposes that emotions are not automatic responses to stimuli, but rather arise from the cognitive evaluation, appraisal, of events in relation to one's goals, values, and coping resources. Primary appraisal asks whether the event is relevant to one's well-being and whether it is beneficial or harmful. Secondary appraisal evaluates one's resources and ability to cope with the event. Different appraisal patterns produce different emotions. Fear arises when an event is appraised as threatening and coping resources are insufficient. Anger arises when someone or something is appraised as unjustly blocking goals. The power of appraisal theory is its explanation for why different people have different emotional responses to the same objective event. Public speaking appraised as an exciting opportunity to share ideas produces enthusiasm. The same situation appraised as a threat to reputation produces anxiety. A relationship breakup appraised as unfair mistreatment produces anger. Appraised as a relief and opportunity for growth, it produces contentment. Cognitive behavioral therapy targets emotional problems partly through appraisal retraining, teaching patients to evaluate events in ways that produce less distressing and more adaptive emotional responses. Paul Ekman's cross-cultural research in the 1960s and 1970s provided strong evidence for universal basic emotions. He showed photographs of facial expressions to people in widely different cultures, including a preliterate culture in Papua New Guinea with minimal exposure to Western media, and found consistent recognition of 6 emotions: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, and surprise. The consistency of recognition across cultures, including cultures with no exposure to Western media, supported the claim that these expressions have a biological basis rooted in evolution rather than being purely culturally learned conventions. The facial feedback hypothesis proposes that the physical act of making a facial expression can influence the emotional experience, not just reflect it. Holding a pen between your teeth, which mimics smiling, makes cartoons seem funnier than holding it between your lips, which prevents smiling. A 2016 replication effort initially failed to replicate this effect, but more recent pre-registered studies have found the effect under controlled conditions. The facial feedback hypothesis remains controversial in its strong form, but has support in its weak form. Facial expressions provide feedback that can modulate emotional experience rather than generating it from scratch. Ekman's research also documented that while basic emotional expressions may be universal, cultures have different display rules, norms about when and how emotions should be expressed, suppressed, or modified in social contexts. Japanese participants watching stress-inducing films alone showed the same facial expressions as American participants. When watching with an authority figure present, however, the Japanese participants masked negative expressions with social smiles, but Americans did not. Display rules reflect cultural values. Many East Asian cultures emphasize emotional restraint and social harmony. Many Western cultures emphasize authentic emotional expression. Emotion is not a simple readout of external events. It is a complex construction involving physiological arousal, cognitive appraisal, learned display rules, and evolutionary heritage. The theories that have competed to explain it, from James-Lange to appraisal theory, each capture something real, and modern emotion science integrates all of them. Emotions are your brain's synthesis of body state, memory, context, and meaning.